happy to welcome all of you. Also, those of us, are we being simulcast?
No,
didn't work. All right. It's just us. All right. Yeah. I'm imagining that there's a huge audience out in TV land. I should just forget that altogether. I knew I shouldn't have gotten dressed up tonight just for you lot. For those of you who are here for the grad open house, great. I think most of you are in virtual land, and I promised them only half an hour ago, hey, see you at the lecture in half an hour. They have no idea. They're not coming back. They're going to IIT from now on. All right, well, thank you guys. It's nice to see you in person. As Jane informs me, starting next Monday, after this, our first lecture of the year, practically, we have a full 3 years worth of events in the next 2 months. So starting Monday, our next lecture, and ongoing with multiple events through the days. Just to get started, it's, of course, a great pleasure to welcome Julia and John McMorrow, who are here with us tonight and have been throughout the year, mostly remote in the fall, as our visiting Greenwald critics, visiting Greenwald professors this year, who've been doing a research studio year. Those of you who may have checked the fine print realize that Julia and John were supposed to lecture 3 weeks ago, but due to a conflict on our end, we had to reschedule that, so we're very pleased also and happy that Julia and John were able to reschedule things and turn it out now. Ideally, that was to make it also align with open house, which apparently there's nobody here, so there's no audience anymore. But they're happy to do the lecture for you, really. The paying customers right here, not potentials. We got birds in hands here, not two in the bush. All right. Julia and John, as you also know, are familiar with us because they're here for reviews on and off, as well as being the Greenwald professors this year, have been partners in the practice studioAPT, or APT, since 2000, and both are teaching at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Julia McMorrow is currently an associate professor of practice in University of Michigan Ann Arbor. She has a B.Arch from the University of Kansas and a post-professional MS from Columbia University's GSAPP. Prior to University of Michigan, Julia also taught at OSU and was a lead designer at Perry Dean Rogers in Boston and 360 Architecture in Columbus. Perhaps most well known to many of you, Julia is the author of Materials, Structures, Standards from 2006, which is now in its third edition, retitled Architecture, Reference, and Specification, as well as another volume entitled Drawing for Architects, which came out in 2015. While the first text is a key text I know used in many of our studios as a kind of foundational studio reference, the second book features the work of many of the offices and practices and people on our faculty, as well as our alums. So she should be well known to all of you in that way. In addition to those publications, Julia's writing has also appeared, and design work has appeared in Paprika, Soiled, Flat Out, and Praxis, among others. Most recently, Julia's research and design have focused on how to imaginatively rethink the codes and practices built around the demand for accessibility. As part of this work, her all-access home from 2019 won first prize for most innovative interior architecture in the Zero Threshold Barrier-Free Living Competition. John McMorrow is currently Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Michigan, where he served as Chair of Architecture Program and Director of the PhD program from 2010 to 13. Prior to the University of Michigan, John was an Associate Professor at OSU, where he also served as Architecture Section Head. In addition to Michigan and OSU, John has also taught at Harvard's GSD, the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and Yale. John, like Julia, also holds a B.Arch from the University of Kansas, as well as a Master of Architecture and PhD from Harvard University. John has worked at OMA AMO in Rotterdam, as well as offices in Boston, New York, and Kansas City. John is perhaps best known as our most insightful and prolific and sought-after critics around today. And his writings have been published in Log, Flat Out, Perspective, Praxis, Volume, Domus, Artform, Hunch, Thresholds, The Harvard Guide to Shopping, and AD, as well as appearing in many of the introductions of many of his colleagues spanning multiple generations. John is kind of like the new Colin Rowe, Ken Frampton, Rainer Banham, go-to person. If you're doing your monograph, you must have an introduction by John. He is very generous that way, unlike many others I could name, and who are very close to you physically right now. In addition to his generosity, John's work is also a contemporary prescience that goes back to the early 2000s. John's PhD dissertation on postmodernism was centered around the figure of Charles Jenks at a moment when POMO was generally dismissed and practically and intellectually. But John clearly saw the future, one that we have all come to inhabit. And so I think it's always with that sense of surprise and counterintuition that John's work has developed. Since 2000, and alongside their teaching, research, and writing, or better, you could say as incorporating their teaching, research, and writing, Julie and John have been partners in studioAPT, studioAPT, which has spanned work from award-winning affordable homes to recent project for this year's Chicago Architecture Biennial, as invited by our own David Brown. In between those domestic and urban scales of projects, they have expanded architectural media with installation performances such as Making It, and a game design on accessibility. Able to remotivate other forms and genres, from John and Julia easily move from TV sitcoms and musicals, stand-up comedy, graphic novels, and sci-fi, toward rendering the discipline of architecture more accessible, not just in physical and spatial ways, but also conceptually and technically. I think that the secret superpower that Julia and John have is an ability to take things that we think of as lacking possibility or slightly have passed their time and their use-by date, postmodernism and accessibility, and actually able to make them fresh and new and transform them in ways into a future that we all now actually inhabit. And their great, I would say, grace, their great good grace is making the rest of us not feel like latecomers to that world, and never saying, I told you so. So with that, please welcome Julia and John McMorrow.
Thank you, Bob. I feel like we shouldn't present anything. Just let it stay there. Thank you, everybody. It's really an honor for both John and I to be here tonight, especially to be the Greenwald Critics this year, and to be able to speak in person, which has been a long time coming. I'm going to start by just introducing what we'll be talking about and how. Our work together, as Bob mentioned, is carried out under the moniker of studioAPT. The name sort of finds itself, its origin literally and methodologically in typology. So the studio apartment where we initially began working and living when we came up with this name. And it now connotes the ambition for our work to have the quality of aptness, sorry, I should take this off, which is to be appropriate or suitable to the circumstances. So tonight we're going to show a set of ongoing projects from the last couple of years, which means they were born in COVID and raised in the mixture of isolation and togetherness that the quarantine years have generated. We'll present this work in three parts, one from each of our individual research areas, and with a conclusion that obliquely builds from the individual into the shared. As you see here, the title of our talk is Possibility, Accessibility, and Togetherness, which will highlight these themes. John.
So I'm going to start our talk with a discussion of possibility in architecture. And this is a perennial issue, something that's always around, but I think it takes on a certain sort of exigency today. I want to start by thinking about a kind of myth of the architect as omnipotent, a myth nobody actually believes, but creates a kind of like perceived hubris around this figure that really centers a lot of the conflict around contemporary architectural ideology. And so I want to sort of dispel this sort of hanging myth by looking quite closely at models of possibility as they've been practiced within architecture. We could start with, we could say, possibility one, or a possibility in relationship to material and physical forces. So here we see Frank Gehry testing the holding capacity of his cardboard desk structure. And this is a sort of zone of possibility that's a relatively safe ground. It either stands or it doesn't stand. This is a sort of ne plus ultra of verifiability when it comes to the possible. But then the much wider frame of possibility, the one that occupies most of our time and attention, is another kind of possibility. This involves the social realm, the political realm, the exigencies of need and the impossibilities of budget. Here we see, again, Gehry working on his proposal for the Eisenhower Memorial, which of course went through many iterations. And I want to argue that this relationship between the sort of one possibility and the other, between the structural and the social, generates a large amount of frustration in the field. And it generates a frustration of architecture, so it frustrates architects, but it also generates a frustration about architecture. Why aren't your promises delivered upon? And it creates both an interior and exterior sense of this frustration. And this frustration, I think, gets dealt with in a kind of relationship between the real and the imaginary. Like what constitutes the real, what constitutes the imaginary, as it has developed within architectural thinking. And I think if we look at this in a few models, it might help us to understand where we're getting into trouble today. And so one model of this, a sort of like older model, would be that of the visionary architect. And here we could think of the vision as something coming full-blown from the mind that then gets projected onto the world. It's not something that exists now, but it's something that could be. It's sort of like, if we think of the Kantian notion of genius, it comes full-blown from the mind. It gets put into the world to be realized, but sort of wholesale. Then we can think of another model of the unreal as it's on its way to become realized, which would be a kind of more experimental paradigm. Here, looking at the pseudolune of archigram, but really just this notion that there's a series of unrealized possibilities that get worked on. Over time, they would be developed to the point where their possibility for realization would be evident, and one could move from there. I think in more recent times, both of these models, although they exist as a sort of historical legacy, have been replaced by another known as the speculative. And I think the speculative is a kind of problematic development of this line of thinking. And I want to rehearse the logic of the speculative by thinking about its etymology in the marketplace. And so here, this is actually the Chicago trading floor. And if we think about speculation in the market sense, a speculation is a sort of bet on the future for it to be realized in a certain way. And so there's no science to whether pork bellies rise or fall, or orange juice rises or falls. It's a sort of bet, and if the bet comes true, you get rich. If it doesn't come true, you are poor for the effort. I think if we apply that model into architecture, it implies a similar kind of bet. So a speculative work is, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, I don't know. We'll let the future decide. And I think that's a very weak ontological basis upon which to imagine architectural futures or to think about the capacity of architectural potential. And so in that light, I've given a lot of thought recently to another potential model. This is Julia thought she drew this drawing, she didn't. This is a picture of David Lewis, the philosopher. He's spent his career at Princeton. He worked in the sort of analytical mode, and he became very much associated with a model of what he called possible worlds. And in these possible worlds, he explored the notion of the counterfactual. Counterfactuals, I know we have some proponents here. Sarah's given a series of studios. And they're formatted around a very simple, if something happens, then something else happens. But what David Lewis introduces into that is this notion of the possible worlds as explorations of possibility that didn't happen, but could be studied. And so if we look at this diagram, A would be the actual world we live in, B would be all of these other possible conditions had something occurred in a different manner. And the use of this possible world within the symbolic logic of modal philosophy does a specific kind of work in that it tests the notion of causality. And so the point of those studies is not so much to figure out the if and the then, but really the space between the two. How is it that propositions are made real? So it's not a study of ecology, it's not a study of political science, it's not a study of some discrete system, it's the idea of looking at the very notion of causality itself. This work is super abstract. I know of it through approximations. As I try to read it in the source material, it's sort of dense and esoteric. But I think this notion of testing the relationship of causality is not only a problem in architecture, but it's a kind of problem in our society today. And so this is the famous image from the Obama and Trump inaugurations. This is a while ago now. We know that Sean Spicer, the press secretary, comes out and tells us that, in fact, and I should just rehearse the logic, on the left-hand side is the Obama inauguration, on the right-hand side is the Trump inauguration. Spicer comes out and rehearses what is seen as the lie, that the Trump inauguration is, in fact, larger, despite the visual evidence to the contrary. And this was seen as sort of like both outrageous and humorous. But on top of that, following up was the infamous quote from Kelly Conway, who points out that, in fact, there were more people at the Trump inauguration because the Trump administration could make this claim because they had access to alternative facts. And I think in this notion of alternative facts, it points out a kind of breakdown that we've seen then and we continue to see on understanding what is the relationship between the evident, that which we see clearly and know, and evidence. And I think there's been a sort of rupture in sort of throughout society in working out this relationship. And I think this is a relationship of causality. And I think architecture today, now, also faces the same kinds of questions about what constitutes its claims and what might we think about it. I think architecture, interestingly, has within its own disciplinary history a way to deal with this question, or a way to maybe approach this question of possible worlds and the sort of interrogation of causality. And I want to rehearse that by looking back at architecture's history. And so in a similar sort of manner, this is the painting The Architect's Dream by Thomas Cole. I think at every lecture I've given here, I think every lecture I've given everywhere uses this image at some point. And here we can see the architect propped up on the top of the column. He's literally sitting on books of architecture. His dream is that he's surrounded by all of these monuments. If you look back into the perspective of space, you also realize that this perspective is itself a history of architecture. So all the way back we have the Egyptians and the pyramid, and then we have the Greeks, and then we have the Romans, and then we have the Gothic. So as we're moving forward, we're literally looking at a sort of perspectival view of historical development. And I think this sort of model of a developmental history is sort of maybe the first understanding one might have of how architecture works, and that there's the earlier begets the later. So the relationship of that causality is quite clear, and here we could think of the relationship between early Greek wooden temple structures and the way those building idioms get translated into stone. And so the father begets the son, the one begets the other. It's a sort of clear relationship of cause. But I think that model of a sort of straightforward causation doesn't actually explain much of architecture's development. And so we could think of something like the relationship of Roman architecture to the Renaissance as something that wasn't developmental in quite the same way because that timeline is broken. We could think of it as a translational history, where there's a sort of selection of one period of time, looking back to another, recouping certain aspects of it, and the line is back and forth because as the Renaissance borrows from the Romans, so too does the description and redescription of the Roman change. And so there's this notion of a sort of conscious translation. But then as we go further in architecture's development of historical models, we could see also something like a revisionist model, where we have something like Stonehenge, which has occupied a sort of point of curiosity as to like who did it and why. And then you get in the 18th century somebody like Indigo Jones, the British architect, who posits that the Stonehenge was actually a Roman temple structure. And so writes a book that describes it in that way, and which is different than the notion of the translational history of the Renaissance. He's actually going back into time and positing a different model for the way we might understand it. It's there to support his own sort of neoclassical tendencies, but it's a kind of rewriting of the historical ledger in order to validate his own conceptions of what is sort of appropriate or possible at that moment. And then, of course, then you get to something like Colin Rowe as a sort of trans-historical model of history where somehow there's a lesion between Palladio's Villa Malcontenta and Corbusier's Villa Stein, that somehow there's a DNA that unites them. And I think in these progressions of historical models, what we see is architecture's own development of trying to understand its historical modeling as precisely a testing of possibilities. And they occupy, I think, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think one way of looking at, architecture in relationship to possibilities is to think about its relationship to a utopia, like the possible development of architecture to some great good. But instead, in this light, I'd like to develop it as a kind of uchronia. And I'll just read this here, which refers to a hypothetical fictional time period of our world in contrast to altogether fictional worlds or land. The world is a neologism from the word utopia, meaning no place, replacing it with topos, with chronos, meaning time. And so in its sort of development, architecture has worked creatively with an understanding of its historical legacy to posit its development. And here, this is just simply the collection of these models, the developmental, the translational, the revisionist, the uchronic. And I want to posit a fifth category that sort of I articulate to invite its development. I think it's latent within architecture's own history. I think it's its next logical step. And here I'd point back to the developments happening in the world today. I think when we think about the positing of a post-colonial, decolonized sense of architecture, we are already engaging in a counterfactual architectural history. So how do we think about the extraction of certain sort of established models with the provisions of new ones is to not only say there was a historical mistake in the past, but to reassert what that historical mistake may have been, and to extrapolate from that point what the possible development might be. Hopefully, I will then pass it to Julia, who will explicate this point with the next example.
Okay, part two. So what I'd like to do is argue that making the built environment more accessible involves making the topic of accessibility much more inviting by moving the focus on accessible design away from hand-wringing, or worse, resignation and avoidance, and actively shifting into productive realms of possibility and potential. Accessibility is a nice word. It means a lot of things, especially though I think for our purposes, physically and sort of emotionally, it's about being approachable. It's about being able to be reached. It's about being friendly and easy to talk to. Accessibility is physical, it's social, it's legal, it's spatial, it's perceptible, and it's imperceptible. This is a text written in 1975, or part of a text written by disability activist Victor Finkelstein. The entire text is called Discovering the Person in Disability and Rehabilitation, in which he argued for a shift from a strictly medical understanding of disability to one that recognizes society's role in the creation of disabling or abling environments. I see the possibility of overcoming disability, he wrote, not by the action of doctors or other individuals, but by the rearrangement of society with the active participation of its physically impaired members. So to make headway on this ambition, he needed to help others to imagine what he meant. So he invented a story about a possible world, which I would now like to share, and I'm now quoting from his story. In order to make my concept of the social nature of disability more clear, I should like to argue by way of an imaginary example which turns the world upside down. Let us suppose that 1,000 or more disabled people who are all wheelchair users were placed together in their own village where they had full management and democratic rights. The villager, being in a wheelchair, is like anyone else in the world of people that she or he comes across in his daily life. He sees wheelchair users on television, and for all purposes, the able-bodied are people only rarely seen and little understood. One thing the wheelchair user architects quickly discover in this village is that since everyone is always in wheelchairs, there's no need to have the ceilings at 9 foot 6 inches or the door heights at 7 foot 2 inches. At last, the buildings are truly in tune with their needs. Let us say that when all the adjustments had been made and become fixed in the wheelchair user society, a few able-bodied people had, through no choice of their own, to come and settle in this village. Naturally, one of the first things they noticed was the height of the doors and ceilings. They noticed this directly by constantly knocking their heads on the door lintels. Soon, all the able-bodied members of the village were also marked by the dark bruises they carried on their foreheads. Of course, they went to see the village doctors, who were naturally also wheelchair users. The wheelchair user doctors said these able-bodied people suffered a malfunction of their functional abilities, which resulted in a handicap. This handicap caused a disadvantage or restriction of activity, which made them disabled in this society. Soon, special aids were designed by the wheelchair user doctors and associated professions for the able-bodied disabled members of the village. All the able-bodied were given special toughened helmets, provided free by the village, to wear at all times. Special braces were designed which gave support while keeping the able-bodied bent at a height similar to their fellow wheelchair user villagers. But one day, when the able-bodied were sitting together and discussing their problems, they realized that they were never consulted by the wheelchair users about their problems in this little society. In fact, they realized that there may be solutions to their problems which had never occurred to the wheelchair users, simply because they never looked at the problems in the same way as those who had the problem. End of parable. So even before Finkelstein brought this up, Selwyn Goldsmith's Designing for the Disabled, A New Paradigm, took architecture to task for its complicity in the creation and promotion of disabling situations by pointing out that it's architecture that must make the accommodation, not the disabled user's body. Goldsmith was trained as an architect, but contracted polio before he began practicing, and accordingly shifted his energy and abilities toward activism and advocacy for architecture that looked at disability. So the idea of bringing to the forefront our thinking about design for accessibility allows architecture to sidestep its tendency to default to a delayed reaction to accommodation and to realize design that is more than, not less than. So I sort of start with this, guided by Finkelstein's prompt to turn things upside down. We could also apply this to something like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think we can agree it's a good and necessary thing that nonetheless still leaves room for more expansive thinking about possibility beyond bare minimums. In teaching about accessible design, I ask students to examine the letter versus the spirit of the law. First, understanding not only what is being required, but more importantly, why. For instance, we can look at a singular passage in the ADA, 307.4, for instance, which is concerned with vertical clearance. What we need to do as described is to provide some sort of barrier, as shown here in the yellow, in locations where ceiling heights are below 80 inches. But I feel that to better understand and as a result better design from this comes from familiarity with the spirit of this idea, which is basically that this specifically dimensioned thing can first be detected by the cane of a visually impaired person, thus preventing this from happening. I would extend this enhanced understanding of what versus why even to seeing more realistically what is implied and possible with a ramp and why it is much more than just a smooth stair. And deeper still, when we employ minimum clearances at doors or the particular dimensions for navigating a door approach, it's useful to imagine ways to surpass what the ADA tells us toward a more critical understanding of how those dimensions came to be in the first place and what could be more possible. So instead of seeing a dimension, I want us all to see Judy Heumann. Judy was the key instigator of the 1977 504 sit-in, where over 80 disabled activists camped out in the San Francisco Health, Education, and Welfare offices for almost a month, pushing for the long overdue implementation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And for a really accessible understanding of this event, you can check out episode 5 of season 5 of Drunk History, which explains it and also has a good sense of humor about it. But Section 504, in short, was legislation that built on previous civil rights laws and focused specifically on non-discrimination of people with disabilities. And without Section 504, there would likely be no ADA, at least not in its current form. So these are images that I think get to the point more quickly and are less likely to be forgotten than pages of rules. These 2 years before this, in 1988, the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced to the United States Congress. It was soon passed in the Senate, but then held up for 2 years in the House of Representatives, until on this day in March 1990, when over 1,000 fed-up disability rights activists descended on the U.S. Capitol. 60 of them discarded their wheelchairs and crutches to crawl up the 83 steps to the entrance. These disabled citizens were not to be ignored, and the Capitol crawl, as it came to be known, is seen as the defining moment that finally forced the passage and then signing of the ADA on July 26th of that year. So the 504 sit-in and the Capitol crawl exemplify the notion that it's difficult to see something you don't understand and to understand something that you don't see, and that even with the best of intentions, the built environment sends a lot of mixed messages, including that even something that's 90% accessible is in fact not at all accessible. Illinois' own Senator Tammy Duckworth, who lost both legs in Iraq, has discussed how for most of her adult life before that, she did not, quote, think about these things. These things she refers to are the multiple barriers to accessibility that are unnoticed by most of society. But now, for her, seemingly minor impediments can determine if she's able to get where she needs to go and do what she needs to do. So I'm quite inspired by Duckworth, and especially in teaching and working on accessibility. And my fundamental ambition is not that we all memorize the ADA or other regulations, but that we simply become attuned to the world around us and to think about these things. An initial aspect of this thinking involves becoming more aware of what messages are being sent about accessibility and whether or not they are in fact friendly and approachable. And I think that once we start to look, it's hard to unsee or unknow the challenges. And while looking, it's pretty clear that in this day and age, we should be long past the idea that the responsibility for access lies with those least likely to have it and most in need of it. So this has been quite a long preamble to sharing 2 projects underway, both with accessibility in mind and its many and varied forms. And so first is the All Access Home that Bob mentioned, which is a prototype of multiple ideas about accessibility in daily life. It's a home for everyone, young, old, tall, short, disabled, or not. The accommodation for differently abled users, those in wheelchairs or in need of other assistive devices or with any of a variety of physical or cognitive impairments, is deeply integrated into the flow and function of the house. The All Access Home is a test case for ideas that can take many forms depending on a house's location and scale. In the domestic space, it allows for trying out bigger ideas in a smaller size. While success or failure in access at all scales often comes down to fractions of an inch, the home takes advantage of minimal sectional differences to set up a variety of spatial circumstances, providing greater ease of movement and use and enjoyment by disabled and able-bodied users alike. The All Access Home might be a singularity, but it might also be a community of many. And in this house, there are no alternative paths of travel or typical and other functions. There is instead a variety of ways to use the house and interact with others. The fundamental ambitions are that the house is attractive and affordable. It does not treat accessible design as an add-on or a lamentable condition. The all-access home is proposed not as an apology, but as an optimistic exploration of plausible living conditions that might transcend the letter of the law in pursuit of celebrating the spirit of accommodation. The functional aspects of the house, like the kitchen, the laundry, storage, transition, become the communal core, and the accumulation of tasks that comprise domestic life are not the settings for more hurdles, but for more possibility, community, and we'll now end on this word, togetherness. Structure.
Yeah, you can tell we really worked on the transitions. That was what we really focused on. To bring things together is the synthetic ambition of architecture. To bring people together is the ambition of our work as studioAPT. What we're going to present here in this final section is a research that we have continued to conduct about how to educate people about issues of accessibility and how to do it in a way that's not moralistic but effective. The paradigm we decided to eventually use is the idea of games and gaming. And games are both designs and events. Games have rules that delineate possibility, and the play is an achievement of maximizing the potentials of those possibilities. The reason we hit on games is the hope that one could create an empathetic understanding of the issues of accessibility, not a cognitive understanding, not the 12-to-1 ratio, but somehow feel the experience in a way that would be translatable. We did this through a series of studies of games, of course. The first study that was on Chutes and Ladders, sort of a children's game that we all know. It's originally developed from an Indian game called Snakes and Ladders, which has a kind of like, it's a rudimentary gameplay, and in its original version combined with some sort of karmic morality in its overtones. It's, you know the premise very well. You move up the board. If you hit a ladder, you get to go up faster. If you hit a chute, you go back to where you started. As we were looking at the game, we realized that there's a sort of fundamental spatial irony that's taking place within it, and that it's basically a horizontal surface of the board that's trying to describe a vertical spatial situation. So here we can see the sort of translation of the board, and we tried to look at that spatial idea as a question of accessibility, and so worked to try to re-spatialize the game, basically converting it from chutes and ladders to stairs and elevators, and using that model as a way to think about how people would. I don't think it's a very fun game. I don't think we made it a funner game, but the idea is by translating this children's game into something more like a building, that we could model the way buildings are differentially accessed. And so playing as the wheelchair user or playing as the non-wheelchair user, able to use the elevators or stair alternately, would give you some sort of deeper sense of what it meant to navigate a building in different ways. The second study we did needs no introduction. We looked at chess, which of course has its own sort of fascinating history. But our main interest was how the game works spatially. First, the board. It's an 8x8 grid of alternating dark and light squares. If you look at it architecturally, you realize that there are certain sort of conditions implied within it, where you're positioned, where you can go, which renders the seemingly openness of the grid to be actually a highly differentiated set of potential positions, which the nomenclature or the designations of chess annotation make clear. And then, of course, the chess also has these series of pieces, which are each distinct not only in its form, but also in their capacity to move. And so looking at the pieces, you can understand that each one describes a capacity, each one has an identity, and each one also in its historical development has changed over time. So they're not like essential conditions, but they operate as a set. and then reapplied to the situation, you can understand that the relationship of the piece to the board describes a wide range of possibility, but not an infinite possibility. It's not an even field, it's actually a highly differentiated field, which you can see here on the right-hand side as a kind of illustration of what's known as the knight's tour, which is like the possible positions that the knight can make to reach various positions. And so in the combination of the board and piece gives us the set. And in addition to the sort of understanding of the game in terms of its intrinsic quality, I think one of the things we learned as we studied chess is that chess is also used quite frequently as a metaphor for other conditions, usually things like a war and strategy, but also implicit within that metaphorical capacity is the way that those relationships scale and become commensurate with the world as a kind of, not only as a kind of modeling, but a kind of synonymy between the two. And so in the case of chess, we used the same board, because we didn't want to design a new board, but we rethought the pieces and what they meant, and using the same nomenclature, but sort of translated what those pieces and their movement meant to represent different sort of levels of ability. Like for the rook, you can read the prosthetic limb, or the wheelchair, or the person with the service dog, and all sort of like variously abled conditions. So to redescribe the differential field of the chess pieces as a kind of like, mapping of the differential field of our relative abilities, and then also further changing the nature of the rules, which in normal chess, is to sort of capture the king as a kind of like dominant. Here, we made it much friendlier, and the idea is for everybody from one side to the other. And so somehow it becomes not about a logic of pursuit, but a logic of sort of navigating out of the way so that the pieces can occupy these relative pieces. This is, of course, over COVID, so we had to figure out a way to do it over Zoom. But then also ran a series of studies, and I would say this was funner than the Chutes and Ladders, but not absolutely fun, which brings us to Julia.
All right. So, and I should mention also that this work is part of an overall project called Measures of Access, for which we received funding, seed funding from the University of Michigan's Prototyping Tomorrow grant. So we're grateful for that. So yeah, what we kind of, in our ultimate goal in looking at other games, and then specifically at Chutes and Ladders and chess, is that they were very spatial, and we're trying to sort of use them as testing grounds to work up to our own game. Working title, Access the Game, or Get Together. We're still working on that. And I think, as John mentioned, like the Chutes and Ladders and the chess sort of challenged our conception of what constitutes fun in a game that wants to provoke a realistic understanding of something that is very spatial. And so important to the process was to somehow accomplish a real feeling of scale and movement that's not an abstraction of either. So in other words, we wanted to remove aspects of pretending in the movement. You either can go somewhere or you can't. If you can't, what do you need to do to change? What do you need to change to ensure that you can? We also realized that games that are too competitive undermined ideas about inclusion, as John mentioned with the chess, but games that were clear and cooperative were really not that much fun. So we began to work on kind of objectives of collaboration and togetherness, but with room enough for friction and some twists and turns along the way. So through play and interaction, Access the Game Get Together facilitates an understanding of difference in the ways that people move through and interact with the world in a physical and didactic manner that hopes to transcend the pitfalls of simply having good intentions toward making accessible environments. And while the general idea of accessibility, I think, is easy to convey, which is to make more things possible to more people, to understand what that entails is a more difficult proposition, because we learn that this can be different for every person. So part tool, part toy, part physical pedagogical system. This is the game in its most recent form. It is a possible world on an 8x8 grid, just like chess. Each player is responsible for 2 people, one ambulatory and one in a wheelchair, as well as 2 pieces of a final communal space. Multiple and compounding rule sets can be developed within the system, so there's lots of different ways it could be easier or harder, but the basic objective is simply to bring everybody together into one shared space. So every turn brings an opportunity to move, but obstacles will abound, requiring recalibrations of movement and a reconfiguring of the elements that make up this world. So how do we know if a person can move into a space? The forms will let us know right away. If a wheelchair can have access, or where an ambulatory figure can stand. In other words, we'll figure out quickly what kinds of spaces make an environment available to all users. And we'll notice these things directly, which is what Victor Finkelstein's parable sort of prompts us to do. We'll figure out how we need to move or what needs to change one step at a time, all the while being very aware of what other players are up to. And simultaneously, you can see these blue pieces starting to move. Players need to work together, sort of form an agreement to get the pieces that make the communal structure or the architecture come together in the same location. So everyone needs to ultimately contribute to this get-together, even if only one person can, I guess, be the winner. And so playing the game sets up opportunities for cooperation, accommodation, and celebration of difference towards understanding. And so I think our goal here is that maybe we learn something and maybe we won't, but it allows an opportunity to kind of like literally get our hands dirty and get in there and try, and frankly to participate in worlds that may exist beyond our own. So that's where we will leave it. Thank you.